Carol Ann, I'd like to talk with you a bit about the fifth Sunday of Lent and the scripture readings for that particular Sunday. You know, I think many people attend church services and we hear the word proclaimed, and the scripture reading sort of goes fast, and you hear a sermon or homily about it, and maybe it makes an impact or not, but I think it is worthwhile to rethink them and to keep them in our consciousness and to try to carry their message with us and to maybe reflect on it. I would think that some people who go to church on Sunday morning throughout the day might have a different slant on the readings. I mean, something happens during the day and it reminds you of something that was read in the gospel, for example. So I'd like to continue to think about what those readings are all about. And today, the gospel, which is these gospels during Lent are marvelous, aren't they? This is from John chapter 11, and it's the story of Jesus raising Lazarus to life. It is a remarkable story, isn't it? I mean, are there elements of it that strike you, for example?
Well, I'm back on what you were saying about how we can carry a message, you know, with us. Reminds me a little bit of the tradition of Lectio Divina in the church, you know, where you'd read a passage of Scripture and there'd be a particular word or phrase that you'd find real resonance with, and then you carry that. And I guess we do it with themes from a liturgy as well.
Yeah, I think that Lectio Divina, which would mean like the reading, the sacred divine reading, and was a technique, wasn't it, for the spiritual life, for growth. And I think that the beauty of it was that you didn't think you had to read a long section of Scripture, but you would just read until something caught you, right? And then you wrestle with the idea for a while, or mull it over, let it roll around in your mind and heart a bit, and to see what it might mean for you. And then after you exhausted it, then you'd go on and read some more. And maybe that does sort of work that way with the Sunday readings. Of course, I mean, I think there's a lot of days you have to say, well, I never advert to them again, right? They're out of mind and so on. But maybe it's helpful to call them back and to get a new slant on them as well.
And just to notice a theme that perhaps did catch our attention, caught our heart in some way. I'm always struck in this gospel with that one line where Jesus says, you know, this sickness will end not in death, but in God's glory. That's a hard line to live out, I think, to trust that at moments of struggle in our life, that it's not a struggle unto death, but a struggle unto life.
Can we reconstruct the storyline a little bit here in the gospel and what has happened here? Jesus hears about Lazarus.
Well, here's about him from probably the friends. He must have been a fairly well-known person, Lazarus, this brother of Martha and Mary.
Yes.
And the message gets to Jesus that this, first of all, that Lazarus was ill. And Jesus doesn't go right away. And then the word comes that Lazarus has died. And then Jesus goes, first of all, meets with Martha.
Yes.
And she cries out, saying, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
Yeah, it's a striking line, yes.
Yeah. And then Mary goes and meets with him. And following upon that, Jesus goes and in response to, well, some would say his great love for Lazarus, his great love for us, it says, still sighing, Jesus reached the tomb. It was a cave with a stone to close the opening. Jesus said, take the stone away. And then Martha gives her, you know, her protest that, Lord, he's been there for 4 days.
Yes,
This isn't going to be a pleasant experience. And still, Jesus, in prayer to his Father, really cries out then, following upon that prayer, Lazarus, here, come out, and restores him to life.
So it's a marvelous story, and one, again, as all the gospel stories, is supposed to have a universal significance to it. I mean, that was the conviction of the early Christians, and certainly the writers of the gospel, that these were not just historical remembrances that helped to keep them together as a community, but they were statements about the Lord's power to continue to influence us. They worked out of the utter conviction that Jesus had been raised to life and continued to be active in the world. That's sort of the perspective of the whole of the Gospels. It's the light within which they function, this belief in the resurrection. And in this case, it suggests that Jesus continues to have power to raise to life, to give life to us, fresh starts, new beginnings, the power of the Spirit. And that suggests to me right away, well, if you're going to appreciate that message, you have to feel the need for that. You could say, well, I'm walking around and I'm alive and and so on, and therefore I don't need the Lord to raise me to life right now. And I think that then takes the passage to some other level for us, or I would say deepens it, because then it suggests to us, well, there might be more than one way to die in life. There might be other kinds of deaths that we experience, and the message would be Christ has the power to help us transform those deaths, whatever they might be, into new forms of life. In fact, that's one of the rhythms of the gospel, isn't it? The seed has to be planted, died, put into the ground in order that it can sprout. We have that whole rhythm of the spiritual life suggested by the Gospels. So my interest then would be, well, in what ways do we find diminishment in our own lives? In what way do we suffer some sorts of deaths? I mean, just let me take one stab at that and to talk about all the broken relationships that we find in the world. I mean, certainly some people who go through terrible divorces feel like it's a death. I've had people say that, and they're grieving as though they had lost a loved one physically. And think of the youngsters that are involved in those kinds of situations. That certainly appears to them to have that death-like quality. Something that was important, alive, vibrant, is now altogether different. The home life is broken up. There's a new situation that one has to adjust to, and so on. I would see that as one of the diminishments of life, a small kind of death, symbolic death that many people do suffer in our world today.
And that's maybe one that has been brought to our attention, through knowing people who are in those experiences, and they're so painful. I'm just mindful, though, as you're talking of other forms of diminishment that maybe kind of fly past us without our recognizing them as such, just with what has happened as a result of technology. I heard someone speaking recently about using a computer, and I said, do you know how? Well, no, I don't think I could ever figure that out. I had the sense that what that gentleman was saying to me was, it's kind of passed me by. And I think that there are dimensions of life that for some people feel as if they're beyond them, and so there must be a dying of a sense of self-worth in an experience like that, a sense of relevance. Do I fit? Do I matter anymore? And the awareness of that also is an invitation to that experience of dying.
I think that's true. And as you were saying that, I was sort of focusing on the word fixation. Part of my sense of how death occurs in life is that people are making progress and growing and developing and learning, and their mind's alive, and then something happens that sort of stops the process. Maybe not in all areas of life, but in a particular area. So one gets fixated at a certain level. Maybe it's, as you suggested, a new technology comes in, and it's overwhelming to you, and you just can't manage it. I mean, you don't want to try anymore. And so it's sort of like a death within that area of your life. You can't grow anymore because the ongoing cutting edge of things is now sort of hidden from your view. It's not part of your whole makeup anymore. So you can't deal with computers. You're going to have to suffer certain deaths, I suppose, in the modern world. Mm-hmm. And you could think of so many other things like that. It's always fascinated to me, what kills people? What kills the spirit? Why do you meet some old people who are sort of with it, and they're still alive, and they know what's going on, and they're interested in a wide variety of things, and they'll still look things up in the dictionary or consult the encyclopedia, and they're still interested and are willing to travel and so on. I mean, it's remarkable. And you'll meet other people who just are in a rut, and they are, for all practical purposes, dead to anything new. They would never look anything up or be interested in going in a new place or have new ideas or have some different kind of conversation. It doesn't occur to them. Why does that happen to people? I always ask that.
Well, and I'm not sure that I'm going to respond to your question, but I'm just struck with the first reading from today's liturgy, that story from Ezekiel, and it follows upon, the image of the dead, the dry bones. It was really a scene of death, and it was into that scene that the Lord God says...
It's Ezekiel, 37,
37,
isn't it?
12 to 14.
Yeah.
And it's into that scene that God offers the promise of new life and of hope. And I guess as you were describing, that phenomena of fixation and the deadness that can come into people's lives, I was thinking, Gloria, it is at a moment like that one would experience great hope if we could really hear this promise of new life.
I think there's a striking sentence in that first reading, isn't there? I mean, when the Lord speaks like that, when we get this powerful idea from Ezekiel that there is a new life and so on.
And I shall put my spirit in you, and you will live.
Yeah.
And I shall resettle you on your own soil, and you will know that I, the Lord, have done this.
Yes. I will put my spirit within you. That's one of the great promises of the Scriptures, isn't it? That
and
the Spirit will be poured out. That was the promise of Joel. The Spirit will be poured out upon you, and that's what the disciples saw happening at Pentecost, wasn't it? Prophecy of Joel and the kind of things Ezekiel talked about is now fulfilled. Christ's life-giving Spirit is pouring out this new Spirit upon all of his followers.
And that's certain. That whole notion is certainly picked up in the second reading, which is Romans chapter 8, verses 8 to 11. You know, it's if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, then he who raised Jesus from the dead will give life to your own mortal bodies through his Spirit living in you. There couldn't be any doubt but that, you know, the Church is trying to assure us of that life that we do carry as a result of the gift of Jesus in the Paschal Mystery.
And I think that becomes so important a message when we are feeling those diminishments. I mean, when people are very depressed, for example, and things look black, and you don't know what you're going to do, you're at loose ends, and can't seem to find any life within you or any new spirit. I mean, you need a message like that. That's another way I would see the diminishments or little deaths that we suffer is in our own spirit, in a way. Our own spirit, which maybe was vibrant at one time and life looked beautiful, and you could say, boy, I can take it on and I can conquer it and I can do new things and make my mark and all that. There seems to get the time for many people, sometimes because of tragedies, it seems to me, when it doesn't look that way anymore. It's more like trudging along, like it's hard to put one foot in front of the other. You wonder if the time's ever going to pass or if ever you can handle this new kind of problem. Or if they give you one new problem, one new challenge, it'll break you. It's more than you can take. There's a sort of death of the spirit that seems to happen. Just flashing on this when I say that, I notice that in movies where there's a triumph of the human spirit, I really get into it. I remember Cool Hand Luke was one movie, and When One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was another one, where that sense came to me, you know, where there's a struggle with, will the spirit arise or not? Can you rise above it? Can you triumph over these evil forces that are trying to put you down and keep you down? And I think, boy, there you see somebody rising above, and you thought the spirit was dead, but no, they come back and strong now. And I suppose you can see that in real life, too, in someone like Nelson Mandela in prison all the years and then coming back and with new power and energy.
Well, even the recent experience we've had of watching the basketball team from Loyola Marymount, you know, moved beyond their experience of grief and loss and undoubtedly terrific confusion, you know, at the death of one of their colleagues.
Yes.
And then that triumph, not quite on to victory.
Well, but interesting, though, but even when they lost, there was that interesting reaction that it wasn't the end of everything. Their sense of loss in the defeat on the floor was not the same as teams usually experience, in my opinion. They responded in some different kind of way, just as they had all along. It wasn't, they said, we don't have the same pressure on us that other people have. It isn't a matter that they just had to win. I think they had to go out and do their best and to set aside for a while the death of their friend and carry on. And I thought, even in defeat, it seemed as though they were victors to me. I loved their attitude and some of the things that they said afterwards.
Well, and it maybe speaks of a kind of a faith vision that they were, maybe not explicitly, but bringing to bear on their experience. I was thinking of that a bit ago as you were...
Well, just before you go on, they had those signs, Hank lives.
You know,
I mean, it did have that sort of new life idea.
That's right. Yeah, they were in communion with that person.
Yes, exactly.
Who has gone before them.
Yeah.
But I was thinking before as you spoke, you know, when you were describing the feelings that we can have at a time of diminishment, it's so important from the vantage point of the spiritual life, I think, to remember at a time like that feelings are not the sole indicator of how we're doing in this faith journey, you know. It's oftentimes when, you know, we're blocked, that the usual feelings aren't there, that the search that is part of our life becomes intensified. Not Joanne Kahn, but it's in her book, Women's Spirituality. There's an essay in there by Connie Fitzgerald on impasse and the dark night, and she describes very powerfully times in our life where we're right up against the edge and we're at an impasse. We can't break through on the level at which we've been existing, and the only way through that impasse is to go to a deeper level. And I think that's really what you were describing there, that to trust and to believe that this promise of new life will grab a hold of my daily existence, even when what I'm feeling is impasse or death. That's a great challenge to faith.
It really is, yeah. And I think you're very wise in sort of disassociating to some degree what we talk about faith and faith convictions from the primary feelings connected with it. Because I do believe that even in the midst of absence and in the midst of diminishments, and when the soul does appear to be downtrodden and we're discouraged, right within that is very often where we find God. I think the presence of the Spirit is not always connected with positive feelings. I think that sometimes the presence of the Spirit is connected precisely with the diminishment itself. It's right within the diminishment that we find new life, I believe.
Well, and isn't that some of what we see operative in our gospel today, where, certainly Jesus was attuned to the feelings of the people who were close to Lazarus. We could, I'm sure, understand that Martha's apparent indignation and anger was perhaps her way of relating her sorrow, and then he's...
You're reading her remark in sort of a petulant way.
Well, yeah,
here?
I mean, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened.
Yes,
where were you? You came for dinner all the other times, and you seem to have missed this big
really
event in our
interesting.
life.
I didn't hear it that way, but that's I see what you're saying.
Now, I don't know. I'll have to wait till I talk with Martha to find out what was really in her heart. But I like to think that was some of it.
Yeah.
But again, that Mary was seen there as grieving and mourning in the house, and that out of that she moved. So we see Jesus attentive to the feelings of others, and indeed anguishing himself. Jesus said, "In great distress with a sigh that came straight from the heart." That's a person of deep feeling. So we see even in this person who is a model for our faith, that he's got a connection between his felt experience and his faith.
Yes, and you would see that played out as well in something like the agony in the garden, wouldn't you, where he's really grieving over his own situation, and maybe in my reading anyway, running out of time to carry on the cause of God and establish the kingdom. But what Jesus is able to do right in the midst of that, "Father, don't make me do this. I don't want to have to drink this chalice, but not my will, but thine be done." And it's out of that he finds perhaps his strength and courage to deal with his coming passion and horrible death. So again, you see Jesus not exempted from the whole process, but the great exemplar of how you ought to deal with it. And I think that is so crucial for people to see, for all of us to see, when we're thinking about Christ, when we're thinking about dealing with the little deaths that we have to struggle with, whether it's the relationship, whether it's the inner life, whether it's the more subtle forms, as you suggested, whatever the diminishments are, Jesus suffered them. I mean, he knew the loss of friends. He knew people who turned against him. He knew leaders not understanding him. And he knew his own spirit in anguish. "Father, why have you forsaken me?" On the cross, you get the same feeling in that remembrance from the psalm. So that we see Jesus thus as the model of rising above, of finding the life within the whole death experience. Thus he becomes, as Paul says, life-giving spirit for us. He becomes exemplar of how we should try to do it, so that in the tough times we don't just feel abandoned and just let down and wallow in self-pity, or just sort of lie there in a comatose state. But there's a call always from the example of the Lord to rise above and to open our hearts to that new spirit he gives us.
And the mysterious paradox that the rising above requires the going through the experience, and I think that it's something for us many days we try to go around the experience of diminishment, whether it's by denial or some other shortcut that we think we can take, and maybe to a certain extent in the past we've been encouraged that that's the way you deal with it. That helps you to rise above it. You pretend it isn't even there, but that isn't what we see happening in Jesus.
Right.
He goes through the experience, and in that that action of God carries him beyond it.
Right. I think the psychologists help us these days with that, don't they? And they're reminding us that we have to face the dark forces, and as Carl Jung would say, bring things out of the shadows into the light of consciousness. face the emotions, deal directly with the things that upset us, the negative emotions and so on. And it's within that and passing through it that one might come to some resolution, to some greater integration, to a new form of life as Christ had promised us. What I'm thinking about as we're saying this is that the promise of the Gospels is not some pie in the sky sort of thing. I mean, it has that element. I mean, there is the notion that if we live this life well on this earth, that we're going to, through our physical death, we will pass into the new life. I mean, and I think that's part of the meaning of this gospel. And we shouldn't really just totally set that aside. I think that is telling us, you live responsibly, obediently, try to be a loving person, follow the gospel, be a good disciple of the Lord, then there is a reward for you. And what's the reward? It's the life of heaven. It's a new glorified life where all the tears are indeed wiped away, and we're in the New Jerusalem, and we have the heavenly banquet. That is the message here. But I think we see exemplified in our daily lives the same rhythms, where the person going through the divorce, for example, by facing it and dealing with all the problems that are involved in it, often that person can come out a stronger person. They will find a new life if they're able to manage it, stay open to the power of the Spirit in and through the experience.
You know, it strikes me, too, how important it is during a season of Lent, such as we're in at this time, to remember that Good Friday and Easter Sunday have already happened. It's not that we're moving towards the first one, you know, but we're living in the fruit of the dying and the rising of Jesus. And so we have given to us the power to live in the way that you're suggesting we're called to live. Maybe part of what Lent does for us is to sharpen our focus and bring us back to remember that indeed that we're living in the fruit of that, and that the very life of Jesus and his way of approaching things is meant to shape the daily experience of diminishment or exaltation or whatever.
I like your idea there of Lent being a time of focusing and maybe sharpening our attention. I think that perhaps a lot of the times the diminishments of life we're not even conscious of them. We're not all that sure of what is happening in life. I mean, maybe people are living a rather narrow, truncated existence, but aren't aware of it. You know, there hasn't been new experiences in their lives, and maybe they really haven't given their loved ones a chance, or ever haven't listened to them for a long time, or haven't entered into deeper conversation with their friends, or haven't expanded their mind by reading or going to a lecture or really listening to the homily or sermon at Mass. You know, and you could sort of, Lent would be a time to become aware of that. In what ways am I diminished in my life? What ways did I get fixated, shut off? And then it's like when you hear these readings about new life and God bringing people back to life, that maybe one can sense that, yeah, there is diminishment in my life and I have to face it.
And maybe the one of the final lines in the Gospel where Jesus says in raising Lazarus, unbind him, let him go free, gives us a clue, I think, to a little exercise we could even practice if we're doubtful about whether this process happens, you know, that diminishment does lead to new life. Just look back maybe over the last 5 years and see where in my life was I at one time less free than I am now, and what was the diminishment and the death that I was called into in order to come to that new life and new freedom. We've probably many times heard the Lord saying, unbind him, unbind her, and let her go free, but that it's the dying and the rising of Jesus that sets us free.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that it's a very hopeful message to me of saying, being able to look at a period of time in one's life and maybe find out where the small deaths did lead to a new life. I mean, maybe there was a time when I wasn't getting along with somebody and there was a misunderstanding, and I mean, it felt like a death in the relationship, but I faced it and maybe went to the person and said, well, we're not getting along and things aren't working right. What is the problem? Let's talk it out. And we're able to do that, and out of it comes a new vibrancy in the relationship. We see each other in a different way. We're more respectful of one another, more sensitive, and you can say, boy, growth really occurred here. Whereas you can look through a period of time in your life and see a lot of exemplifications, it seems to me, of this fundamental theme we're talking about, and especially the power of Jesus to give this new life, because that's what the gospel's all about finally, isn't it? The Jesus who raised Lazarus to life has the power to raise us to life and to help us to transform the death experiences.
And I think we have to remember that promise as it's been worked out in our own life in order to allow ourselves to be drawn into a new diminishment. Diminishment isn't something that we opt for, I don't think, very readily. But when we begin to see that prior diminishments have been the occasion of our coming to new freedom in life, that gives us hope that the one we're experiencing now will also, have that same pattern.
I think there is a sort of a promise element in the whole Gospels that's rooted in our experience. The large promise is rooted in the experience of Jesus and his death and resurrection, that is guaranteed to us that finally in our own deaths we will pass to a new life. So you have sort of an experiential base. Someone in our history has done it. He's gone ahead of us to prepare the way for us. And also the same way with the little diminishments of life. You have to see them and see the way new life came out of them. And that's when you sense the power of the promise that the Lord gave us.
And maybe that's the way this shift that Paul's talking about occurs too, from being unspiritual to being spiritual. It's the repetition of that experience of diminishment, death, new life that keeps turning me around to be focused more and more on the things of God, so that I'm becoming more and more the man of the Spirit or woman of the Spirit. That I think Paul's encouraging us to.
Good. That helps pull that together, Carol Ann. We've been talking now about the fifth Sunday of Lent. It's the A cycle. It's the reading of the 11th chapter of John and Jesus raising Lazarus to life. And our suggestion has been that speaks to us today in our own experiences, especially as we look at the diminishments in our life, the small deaths, and we see the power of Jesus to help us rise above them. And as you suggested repeatedly, to live through these experiences and thus find the power to transform them. That's when we know that Jesus also raises us today to life.